In June of 1941, Nazi Germany shocked the world once again when it invaded the Soviet Union. This invasion was nicknamed Operation Barbarossa, and it was the largest ground invasion in the history of the world. With millions of his troops and thousands of tanks and aircraft swarming Eastern Europe, Hitler was expecting a swift victory against Stalin's Red Army. But the Germans soon found out that the Soviets were not going to surrender their country so easily. The resulting war on the Eastern Front became the scene for some of the Second World War's most brutal battles, and it marked the beginning of the end of the Third Reich. The invasion of the Soviet Union was a surprise to almost everyone, but Hitler himself had been planning this war for years, even as far back as 1925, when he wrote Mein Kampf, and he stated that Germany needed to acquire what he called living space to support future generations, and claimed that the German destiny was to turn east. Despite this, the two nations maintained somewhat distant relations, entering a non-aggression pact in 1939, in which they worked together to split up Eastern Europe between them into what they called their spheres of influence. They even cut Poland in half to share like a slice of cake. In 1940, they entered an economic alliance as well, and the Soviets received an official invitation to join the Axis powers, but Stalin would only join under the agreement that Germany would stay out of the Soviets' plans in Eastern Europe, and Hitler didn't even respond, as he probably would have broken this truce anyway. So, long story short, this alliance never formed, and it was never really likely to form, because despite being somewhat friendly with each other for a time, Hitler and Stalin were growing more and more suspicious of each other every day. Soviet generals were already referring to Germany as their greatest enemy, and German propaganda at the time labeled people of Slavic descent as aliens and subhuman. There was even a ban on relations between German citizens and Slavic workers, for which the death penalty was a possible punishment. Heinrich Himmler believed that Eastern Europe would one day only be populated by people with Germanic blood. Along with the racism branded into Hitler's smooth little brain, there were many reasons why the Soviet Union was a desirable target. Russian oil fields and quarries would power the Nazi army. Ukraine's agriculture could feed Germany, and this could all be produced through forced labor of the Slavic people. Many German analysts warned Hitler that this invasion could actually be an economic burden to Germany instead of a boost, but he ignored this criticism. He believed that an invasion of the Soviet Union would actually be quick and rather simple, as he thought that the communist regime was such an inadequate way to govern that they wouldn't be able to muster much of a fight. He famously stated, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." Perhaps the smiles and diplomacy were just a way for Hitler to buy time and watch until he was ready to strike. In late 1939, as part of the Spheres of Influence deal, the Soviet Union invaded Finland, and by early 1940, they'd suffered surprising and humiliating losses to guerrilla tactics from the much smaller Finnish army, signaling to Germany that the Soviet military was disorganized after many of its generals had been executed by Stalin. Hitler was confident in his plans and began drawing up his strategy for the invasion the following year. On June 22, 1941, the fighting began as bombing raids were launched on the Soviet-occupied half of Poland, and an immense artillery barrage pounded the entirety of the Soviet border. Following this, 3.8 million Axis soldiers stormed across the Soviet border in a three-pronged attack to strike the most valuable targets. Army Group North headed toward the city of Leningrad, today known as St. Petersburg. Army Group South marched toward Ukraine to take Kyiv, and Army Group Center was aiming straight for Moscow. The German Luftwaffe above the troops had taken the Soviet Air Force by surprise and destroyed many of their planes while they were still on the ground, but even the ones that were able to take off were vastly outnumbered and quickly shot down. The Luftwaffe reported destroying more than 3,000 aircraft in the first few days, and Soviet reports showed even higher numbers. They also annihilated command centers and supply depots within the first hours of the fighting. With total air superiority, especially in the north where German planes launched from Finnish air bases, the German soldiers and tanks moved swiftly through the countryside, smashing through the poorly prepared Soviet front lines with record speed. The Germans were moving so fast that they circled around and behind large groups of Soviet soldiers who were too slow to retreat, surrounding them from all sides and closing them off from supply lines, giving them no way to escape. These circling tactics killed and captured hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and left thousands more besieged behind enemy lines for weeks. Stalin had been slow to respond to the threat as he had underestimated the actual danger that it posed to his nation. These slow responses led to large amounts of territory being lost every day. It seemed Hitler was correct about his enemy's ability to withstand an invasion, and everything was going according to plan. He even said to his generals, "Before 3 months have passed, we shall witness a collapse of Russia, the like of which has never been seen in history." It was crucial to Germany that this war be over as quick as possible to give the Soviets no chance of fighting back, a strategy very similar to the blitzkrieg tactics that took Western Europe so quickly. But before long, problems were starting to pile up. For starters, Germany had anticipated that in the initial frontline battles, they would completely wipe out the Soviet armies, leaving Moscow defenseless and ripe for the taking. Indeed, they had destroyed most of the air force and killed or captured nearly 1 million soldiers by the end of the summer, but it seemed that the Soviet army was somehow only growing. German intelligence had seriously underestimated the size of the Soviet army and the reserves of troops that it could pull from deep within its country. Along with this, the Luftwaffe were beginning to lose a lot more aircraft as they ventured further from Germany. The three army groups were running into their own problems as well. Army Group North had steamrolled through the Baltics and reached its target, Leningrad. But even after completely surrounding it, the city refused to surrender, turning the fight from a conventional battle into a slow, devastating siege. Army Group Center encountered heavy rainfall as they pushed through Belarus, nearly immobilizing their tanks. The Soviets jumped on this opportunity and launched a massive counterattack, but were destroyed largely thanks to the Luftwaffe tank buster squadron. Army Group South faced the largest resistance of the three, and the Carpathian Mountains in western Ukraine posed a serious obstacle to the German advance. But, likely due to poor coordination, the Soviets sent their tanks in small groups in a disorganized manner, and German anti-tank weapons were able to secure victory in the region. The groups were making significant progress towards their destinations, but they had covered so much ground that their own supply lines from Germany were also getting stretched thin, and many of the Soviet forces that had been circled and cut off earlier were now attacking them from behind the German lines. Ignoring the complaints of his generals, Hitler ordered Army Group Center to halt its march toward Moscow and instead to turn around and finish off the leftover pockets of Soviet forces that were wreaking havoc, and to move north and south to aid the other two groups. These massive battles lasted all the way until the middle of September, and the German army was finally ready to continue its push to Moscow. Stopping and turning around for a few weeks was a must for the Germans, but it had given the Soviet Union crucial time to pull itself back together and fortify lines of defense around Moscow. And most importantly, it had given Stalin the opportunity to relocate factories away from the front lines and all the way to the Ural Mountains, where they would be safe from any attack and would be able to pump out ammunition and vehicles not only without interruption, but at an even faster pace than they had been before. While the factories were being set up, supply ships from Britain were arriving with much-needed weaponry, and the United States sent tens of thousands of trucks to help the Soviets transport goods from all over their country. This was turning into a war of production, and Germany was far from home. As the German forces continued their push toward Moscow, a new enemy was getting ready to join the fight: winter. Along with worsening weather, the Germans were now encountering legitimate Soviet fortifications, and their advance was slowing down quickly. They had to finish this fight while they still had the upper hand. Beginning in autumn of 1941 was the German offensive known as Operation Typhoon. This was the plan to capture Moscow, the cherry on top of Operation Barbarossa. New Soviet front lines had been hastily set up to resist this attack, and the Germans relied on their trusty blitzkrieg tactics to advance through them, with panzer squads speeding through the lines and isolating groups of Soviet soldiers from support before eliminating them. The plan to attack Moscow was to perform a pincer attack, where the army splits into two groups and flanks around an enemy. The plan was to use this pincer attack to cut off railways to Moscow and then attack the city from the west. Initially, the Germans were making significant progress daily, but the month of October had different plans for them. Ice-cold autumn rains turned the landscape into a muddy nightmare, and German tanks were getting stuck in the mud. At this pace, they could only move a few kilometers each day, and the mud made it difficult to perform their signature pincer moves on Soviet defenses. As German forces crawled closer and closer toward Moscow, citizens began to flee the city in waves, and most government officials had been moved further east. But Stalin himself stayed in the city, hoping to keep morale up in his people. He even ordered the traditional October Revolution Day military parade to be held in the center of the city, an act of defiance to the approaching German forces. Meanwhile, outside the city, women and teenagers were digging deep anti-tank trenches to prepare for the arrival of the Germans. The mud problem was finally fixed in November when the ground froze over and the German successfully moved north of the city and cut off the railway tracks there. South of the city, however, the Germans were having serious trouble securing things as the Soviets were putting up fierce defenses and counterattacks. And with every extra day that the Germans took to get to Moscow, the temperatures continued to drop. The German armies were just 20 kilometers from Moscow when the Russian winter arrived in all its wrath. Heavy snowfall covered the landscape day and night, and temperatures dropped to minus 40 degrees Celsius, immobilizing certain parts of the diesel engines in German tanks. It was so cold that it was commonplace for soldiers to light fires underneath their vehicles to keep warm through the night. Lubricant for artillery shells froze and had to be manually scraped off before firing, and machine guns were jamming constantly. Many German soldiers didn't have proper winter gear either, so at this point there were more injuries from frostbite than from Soviet bullets. Some sources say that the German troops weren't supplied with winter coats from the start of the invasion because, other than Hitler's expectation of a quick victory, being given a winter coat in the summer means that the war is expected to take several months, and this would be bad for German battle morale. So, instead, supply lines were now rushing to get the proper gear all the way to the German front lines for winter, and much of the gear simply didn't arrive in time. On December the 2nd, the Germans stopped fighting and were ordered to dig in for winter and invade when the weather improved. So, while the offensive had been momentarily halted and the Soviets were gearing up to defend Moscow, Hitler was still confident in his operation. After all, the three army groups had almost completed their objectives. Army Group South had done its job not only in taking Kiev, but already conquering all of Ukraine and getting close to Russia's oil fields. Army Group North was sure that Leningrad would soon crumble under the pressure of the siege, and Army Group Center was mere kilometers from Moscow. Victory was almost in his hands. All Hitler's army had to do was get to Moscow and deliver the knockout punch to Stalin, but the Soviets had an ace up their sleeve. At this time, on the other side of the world, a Soviet spy named Richard Sorge conclusively informed Joseph Stalin that Japan had absolutely no plans to attack the Soviet Union anytime soon. Sorge had been undercover for years, posing as a German journalist. He had even infiltrated and gained the trust of high-ranking Nazi officials, where he was so well trusted that when he decided to quit drinking, everyone congratulated him on being so dedicated to his work that he wouldn't let alcohol distract him, but in reality, he had quit drinking because he would spill Soviet secrets when drunk. His fluency in Japanese helped him earn the trust of Imperial Japan after he was sent there by his German newspaper company, and he was described as a typical swashbuckling, arrogant Nazi, though he was far from it. There's a lot to tell about Richard Sorge, but to keep it brief, he's often regarded as one of the best spies of all time, as he was able to gain the Axis's trust and infiltrate high levels of Nazi intelligence. His cover was blown just a month after sending home this crucial information, and he was imprisoned, tortured, and later hanged by the Japanese. After his death, he was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union for his actions. Alright, so how is this spy story relevant to Moscow's desperate situation? You see, because of his reports that Japan was uninterested in attacking the Soviet Union, Stalin transferred all of the troops that were stationed in eastern Russia to Moscow, where Germany was now stuck in for the winter. In comparison to the rest of the Red Army, who had recently been drafted and were poorly trained or were exhausted from the war, these reinforcements, many of which were from Siberia, were experienced divisions. Many of them had been trained for winter combat, and they arrived with 1,700 tanks and 1,500 aircraft. Soviet weaponry was also designed to survive the cold, unlike much of the German gear. This caught the Germans completely off guard. Nazi intelligence had once incorrectly assumed that the Soviet Union had exhausted their supply of soldiers and wouldn't be receiving enough reinforcements to muster up a counterattack, but the Red Army now numbered over 1 million in Moscow. The Soviets started their attack on the northern group on December 5, 1941, with the southern and western counterattack starting the next day. In the north, Soviet forces moved with such speed and precision that they began encircling German forces. Hoping to give them a taste of their own medicine, the Soviets rushed to surround them, but the Germans retreated just in time. Though they avoided being surrounded, their defenses were shattered, and they were now on the run with the Soviets right on their tails. In the south and the west, the Germans were losing ground so quickly that they were retreating without approved orders from Hitler, who was furious and told them to hold their grounds with whatever they could, even digging trenches with howitzer shells if needed. Several high-ranking officers protested these actions and were simply removed from their positions. Hitler then fired his commander-in-chief, Walther von Brauchitsch, and took charge of all military decisions. He was desperate to hold his grasp on Moscow, but his grip was slipping. The strongest resistance came from the German center, but by January 7, 1942, the German forces had been pushed back 250 kilometers. Much of the success came from the superiority of the Soviet T-34 tank, whose angled armor made it difficult for the Germans to get a direct hit. The Soviet Air Force was also making a comeback, while the German Air Force had been weakened from anti-air guns during many of their bombing runs into Moscow. The Battle of Moscow was the first Soviet victory against the Germans, and it was the first of many to come. The failure of Operation Barbarossa to take Moscow had a serious effect on Hitler and his ego. He had now surrounded himself with advisors who, while loyal, had little to no combat experience, something oddly similar to the Soviet situation at the beginning of the war. Germany had lost over 1 million soldiers in the conflict, with not much to show in return. The Soviets, on the other hand, had lost nearly 5 million and still showed no signs of slowing down. These immense numbers of casualties would only grow for both sides as the Soviet Union launched repeated counterattacks to regain their lands, and the German army never truly recovered from these battles. It must have been quite embarrassing for Hitler to be publicly defeated by a group that he had called subhuman. During the next year of fighting, the Soviet Union was making significant progress, pushing the Germans back. During a meeting with the Allies, Stalin complained that while he had the Germans running, the United States and Britain were biding their time helping out, pushing the Allies to finalize their plans for the D-Day landings. Once the Allies landed in Western Europe, Germany was heavily outnumbered, surrounded, and struggling with wartime production. Oftentimes, World War II is oversimplified to the heroes of the Western Front, but the sacrifices made by the Soviets can't be overstated, and it was Operation Barbarossa that had pulled them into the war in the first place. By spring 1945, Stalin's Red Army had reached Berlin, and the Third Reich was coming to an end. Perhaps the Second World War would have gone very differently if Hitler had learned from Napoleon that you should never attack Russia in the winter. So I really hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe. And thank you for watching.